Her palms were flat against the earth. Cold, damp, mud-soaked earth. The kind that held the memory of last night's frost and did not let it go, even when the morning tried to warm it. Avenna Ironwood pressed her hands into that ground and breathed. Slow, measured, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she had taught herself to breathe in the first year when she still cried. Before she learned that crying made things longer, she had stopped crying in her second year. The outer labour yard of Duskmere Pack smelled the same every morning. Wet stone, pack animals in the pens to the south, cold iron from the enforcement building that sat low and grey on the yard's eastern edge, its windows always dark, its door always unlocked, as if it wanted to remind everyone nearby that it was ready. The grey-brown wool of her assigned dress had soaked through at the knees. She noticed it the way she noticed most things now, clinically, with the detached precision of someone cataloguing facts about a situation she could not change, only survive. Rykeron Gravesend stood over her. He was not loud. That was the thing about Rykeron that Avena had identified in the first month of his appointment as the Pack's Delta Enforcer. Loud men needed to feel powerful. Rykeron already felt powerful. He had never needed to raise his voice to make the yard feel smaller, and he did not raise it now. He simply stood, broad and deliberate, with the particular patience of a man who had done this before and expected the same outcome he always got. No resistance, no sound, no inconvenience. He would get all three. Not today. But soon, Avena thought. Soon. She did not know where that thought came from. She had stopped thinking things like soon a long time ago. Soon implied something coming. Avena had trained herself to stop expecting anything to come, because the expectation was always the sharpest part of the disappointment. She lived in the space between one day and the next. She planned only as far as the end of each task. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. She carried herself through the hours with the careful, quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that she was the only person keeping herself alive, and that this responsibility required her full attention. And yet, the thought had arrived on its own. Soon. She filed it away and held still. The other pack members moved around the yard's edges, the way water moved around a stone in a stream, not stopping, not looking, like simply altering course without acknowledgement. This was the arrangement they had all agreed to without ever discussing it. Looking at Avenna Ironwood directly was a form of association that had consequences. Consequences that fell on the person looking, not on Rykeron, not on the Alpha, not on anyone with the authority to decide consequences. It was cleaner to not look, simpler, easier to live with. Avena did not blame them. She had stopped blaming anyone but Jarek's Lockmere approximately 18 months ago, when she completed the quiet accounting of her circumstances that she had been running since her 18th year, and arrived at the only conclusion the numbers supported. One man made this. Everything else was compliance, and compliance, while not the same as cruelty, was not the same as innocence either. She pressed her palms harder against the cold earth. Above her, through 2 floors of timber and old stone, she could hear the pack house being rearranged. The good plates, the formal ones that only came out of the locked cabinet in the back storage for crown visits and alliance meetings, were being moved. The sound travelled down through the floors in the distinctive pattern she had memorized, the careful percussion of plates that were heavy enough to break if dropped, carried by people trying very hard not to drop them. The senior wolves were dressing. She could smell the pressed wool and the formal oil that Kalira Lockmere used on ceremonial occasions, drifting down through the ventilation gap where the East Wing's old stonework had never been properly sealed, 3 long trumpet calls split the grey morning air. Clean, evenly spaced, are the formal announcement of a royal company approaching. The Eternal King's delegation was early. Rykeron's hand paused. Just for a moment, he glanced toward the outer gate with the involuntary attention of a man whose status depended on being present for the right moments, and the arrival of the Eternal King of the Ashen Throne was, unquestionably, one of the right moments. He looked back down at Avena. She kept her face turned toward the ground. She did not let him see what was in it. The small, involuntary thing that had arrived when the trumpet sounded, the thing that was not quite hope because she had amputated hope years ago, and did not trust its return, but was something like it, something adjacent to it. The acknowledgement that today was different, that the air was different, that 3 trumpet calls could rearrange the geometry of a morning in ways that a Delta Enforcer's patience could not. Rykeron made his conclusion. He moved on. Avena pressed her hands against the earth and breathed. Her name was Avenna Ironwood, 22 years old. Dark amber hair, worn in a single braid today, because the morning had not given her time for anything more, and because loose hair caught on things in the yard, and she was practical about the body she had to maintain. It was the only thing in Duskmere that genuinely belonged to her, and she maintained it carefully. She stood 5'7", lean in the specific way that people who work without adequate food become lean, functional, able, nothing wasted, but carrying the shadow of a deficit that had been running too long. Her hands were calloused across the palm from 5 years of labor work. The knuckles of her right hand were slightly enlarged from a break that healed without proper setting. Her dress was the pack's standard labor wool, grey-brown, the left sleeve mended 3 times with thread of a slightly different weight, the hem let down twice as she grew taller in years when no one was measuring her. She had been designated Omega at 17. In a healthy pack, an Omega was the lowest rank in a living hierarchy, the most receptive wolf, the peacekeeper, the one who held the emotional center of the group. There was purpose in it. There was standing in it. Duskmere Pack was not a healthy pack. Under Jarex Lockmere's 15-year rule, Omega was not a rank. It was a disposal category. It meant, this person has no political value, no wolf standing, and no protection under pack law. It meant her labor belonged to the pack's common need without her consent. It meant she slept in the labor quarters on the compound's east side, the cold side, the side where the outer wall received no afternoon sun, the side that in winter developed frost on the interior stones. She had slept on the east side for 5 years. She knew every crack in the wall. She knew which floorboard near the door required a careful step to avoid sound. She knew the pattern of the wolf who patrolled the yard outside her window, which nights he was punctual, which nights he was not. She knew the inside of this cage the way a person knows it when they have been inside it, long enough to stop expecting the door to open. She also felt something every single morning that she had never been able to explain away. A warmth behind her ribs, a pressure, not painful, but insistent, like a hand pressing steadily against the inside of her chest, asking, oriented, alive and entirely separate from her own heartbeat, with its own rhythm, its own temperature, its own awareness, her wolf, or what the pack healer, Virel Winford, called a phantom wolf feeling, a psychological condition that occasionally presented in genetically defective pack members whose bodies produced the hormonal signals of wolfhood without the actual wolf capacity. She had explained it gently in the first year, with the careful expression of a woman delivering a diagnosis she found unfortunate. Avena had wolf instinct, wolf senses, wolf feeling, but no wolf. A signal with no source, an antenna receiving broadcasts from a transmitter that did not exist. Or Avena had been told this so consistently, by so many voices, for so many years, that she had eventually stopped arguing with it. Not because she believed it. She had never fully believed it. But because, living inside a false explanation that everyone around you confirms, eventually stops feeling like a lie and starts feeling like the shape of the world. You stop pressing against it. You build your life around it instead. She pressed her palm against her sternum now, standing in the grey morning yard, and felt the warmth there, steady and insistent. Still here, she thought. The warmth pressed back. From the narrow window above her sleeping pallet, Avena watched them come. Black horses, mountain-bred, carrying themselves with the specific assurance of animals that had been treated well their entire lives and had no reason to expect otherwise. 12 riders in ash-grey livery, the Crown's formal travelling formation, 2 at the front, 8 at the flanks, 2 at the rear, and at the column's centre, on a horse that stood half a hand taller than every other horse in the company. A man. She had expected pageantry. She had expected gold and ceremony, and the deliberate architecture of power performing itself. What she saw instead was stillness. He rode without flourish, without the performed ease of a man who wanted to be seen riding well. He simply rode, as if the horse, and the road and the morning were all exactly where they were supposed to be, and he was simply occupying the same space. He was broad through the chest and shoulders, dark-haired, the kind of build that came from genuine use over years, rather than from the particular vanity of demonstration. He wore the king's formal travelling grey, but it sat on him the way clothes sit on a person who has forgotten they are wearing them. He crossed the outer gate threshold, and his head turned. Not toward the pack house steps, where Jarek's Lockmere had descended with the careful, welcoming expression he had spent 10 days practicing. Not toward Kalira or Nixel standing at their father's flanks in their formal dresses, positioned like strategic ornaments. Not toward the assembled senior wolves in their practiced formation of welcome. Toward the east wing. Toward her window. The distance was 40 feet. She was behind glass. The morning light was against her. He should not have been able to see her at all, but his gaze landed on the window with the precision of a man who had known exactly where to look before he arrived. Avena stepped back from the glass. Her wolf pressed against the inside of her ribs with a force she had not felt in 2 years, hard and sudden and certain, like something recognizing something it had been waiting for. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, hard, holding it there, and stood in the middle of her cold east side room, with her heart doing something she did not have words for. She did not know what was coming, but the warmth in her chest did. 2 miles outside Duskmere's outer wall, Elric Ashcroft, eternal king of the Ashen Throne, stopped mid-sentence. Torin Crowell, his senior advisor, was explaining the revised water rights language in the territorial census documentation. It was important language. There had been 3 counterfilings from the southern border packs in the past 6 months, and the language needed to be precise. Torin was precise about language. It was the quality that had made him indispensable for 12 years, and he had been mid-clause when the king stopped responding. Torin stopped talking. He watched Elric's nostrils move, just once, the single involuntary motion of a wolf catching something on the wind. The mountain road was open and cold, the morning air carrying pine and frost and, from the east, the faint, complex smell of a pack compound. Bodies, animals, fires, the compressed organic density of many wolves living in one place for many years. And underneath all of it, something else. Something that pressed against its own edges like a voice behind a sealed door. at something that smelled of ember and winter rain and compression, the scent of a wolf that had not been permitted to surface, but that had been pressing for so long it had left a signature on everything around it. Elric's chest tightened. Thorin had served this man for 12 years. He had watched him receive the reports of 6 unsuccessful searches across the eastern reaches. He had watched him read the seer's account 4 years ago with the expression of a person receiving information that reorganized everything. Quietly, without display. The way very deep things rearranged themselves in people who had learned to process them internally. He had watched him continue with the work of ruling a kingdom while carrying the particular patient weight of someone waiting for something he could not make arrive on his own schedule. Or Thorin read the current silence with the accuracy of 12 years. "You found something," he said. "Someone," Elric said. He did not say anything else. He started riding again, at the same pace, his face settling back into the composed readiness of the Eternal King, approaching a formal arrival. But Thorin, riding at his left shoulder, watched the king's jaw set in the way it set when Elric had made a decision that was not going to be unmade, and filed the observation accordingly. The delegation had arrived 2 hours early. That had not been an accident. Elric rode through Jarek's Lochmere's welcome with the smooth efficiency of a man who could conduct this performance without engaging the part of himself that was actually present. Jarek's welcoming address was practiced and thorough. His daughters were positioned well. The senior wolves were assembled with appropriate deference. The ceremony of it was competent. Elric noted all of it with the surface of his attention and gave most of himself to the compound. The scent of the silver compound was in the foundation stones of the east wing. Not fresh, years of accumulation, the residue of regular dosing pressed into the mortar by time, by repetition, by daily proximity. The concentration was heaviest along the east side. He had identified this signature in 3 other packs over the past 4 years. A silver-based neural suppression agent, administered regularly, accumulating in the structural materials of the spaces where the subject lived. Like a stain the administration left without knowing it. Like evidence. The wolf he could sense beneath the compound was alive. No, she had never shifted. The signature of an unshifted wolf had its own particular quality, a compressed potential with no release point, energy with nowhere to go. But alive was not the word that was accurate. Alive made it sound peaceful. This wolf had been pressing against suppression for years. She was not peaceful. She was the specific ferocity of a thing that had been held down long enough to learn that the holding was not permanent. Thorin appeared at his right shoulder as the formal greeting concluded, and the delegation was escorted toward the guest quarters. "The eastern wing," Thorin said quietly, below the hearing of the pack's escort. "Before midnight," Elric said. The pack house went quiet at the 11th hour. Elric moved through the servants' corridor without a torch. His eyes adjusted in the dark the way a wolf's adjusted, needing only the faint ambient light from the ventilation gaps, the thin grey glow of the overcast night beyond the high windows. His advance team had surveyed the layout 3 weeks prior. He knew the location of every room on the east side. He knew which corridors the night patrol followed and at what intervals. He moved without sound. Not with effort. Naturally, the way a wolf moves when there is no conflict between what it wants and what it is doing. The compound smell was strongest at the end of the east corridor, the last door on the left. He stood outside it for a moment, reading the air. Her wolf was awake. The proximity produced a response in his own chest, a recognition, a pull, to the specific sensation that no scientific language had ever fully captured, and that every bonded wolf in history had described the same way. Like coming home to a place you have never been. He drew the latch slowly. She was awake. Of course she was awake. She sat on her pallet with her back against the cold stone wall and her knees drawn to her chest, and she looked at him with an expression that was not fear. It was something older than fear, and more precise. It was the expression of a woman who had encountered unexpected presences in this room before and had developed a protocol for them. The protocol was, do not move, do not speak, assess. He stood in the doorway and held himself still. He let the corridor light fall into the room without crossing the threshold. He kept his silhouette as open as he could make it, both hands visible at his sides, shoulders deliberately neutral, nothing in his posture that required a response. He looked at her. He was very good at looking at people, at taking in what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. He had trained himself to do this over years, because a king who saw only what he expected was a king operating on a world that existed only inside his own assumptions. So he looked at Avenna Ironwood with the full, deliberate attention of a man who had come a long way to find her and wanted to see her accurately. The mended sleeve, the careful thinness, the old bruising at her wrists in the layered pattern that meant repeated injury rather than a single incident. The posture assembled over years, shoulders slightly inward, the weight distributed for stability, a body that had made itself compact because compact things were harder to reach. Her eyes, alert, precise, giving away nothing. The eyes of someone who had developed the skill of having an interior life that did not surface unless she chose it. And her wolf, at this distance, with only a door between them, pressing outward with a force that made him exhale slowly, carefully, so she would not hear it. "You can move back from the wall," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice he used when he needed someone to understand that there was no reason to brace. "I am not here because anyone sent me. I am not going to hurt you." She did not move. Her eyes did a second pass across him, position, access to the door, the distance between them, what he was and was not carrying. Then she said, and because silence was a tool she had learned, could also be turned against her. "What do you want?" "Your name," he said. "And then I want to ask you something about the drink they give you with your meals." The room went completely still. Avenna's face did not change, but her hands, which had been loose against her knees, pressed slightly inward. The specific involuntary motion of a person whose body has understood something before their mind has caught up. She studied him for a long moment. In the dim light of the corridor, seeping through the doorway, she took her measure of him. Not the king, not the ceremony, not the title. The man. She was very good at measuring people. 5 years of survival in a pack that had arranged itself against her had made her extremely good at it. He had not moved toward her. His hands were still open. His voice had been even. He had asked for her name before anything else. "Avenna," she said carefully. "Avenna Ironwood." He held her gaze with those pale, winter sky eyes, and the look in them was steady in a way that had nothing to do with authority or performance. It was the look of a person who was entirely present. "I know," he said quietly. "I have known your name for 4 years. He sat on the floor. It was such a simple thing, such an unexpected thing. The eternal king of the ashen throne sat cross-legged on the cold floor of her labor room, his back against the far wall, approximately 6 feet from where she sat on the pallet, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to be inside her choice about who occupied her space. He had asked permission before he moved. She had not said yes outright. She had looked at the floor in front of him and then looked away, which he had interpreted correctly as proceed. She was not going to think about how he had interpreted it correctly. There were too many other things to think about. "How long have you been receiving the tonic?" he asked. 5 years. "Who brings it?" "Iskira Gravesend. She's in kitchen staff. She doesn't know. She just brings what the schedule says." "And the instruction came from Varel Winford." "From the healer's office. I was told it supports the blood for wolves with low development." She heard herself say Jarex's language and felt a brief, cold thing pass through her. "That is what I was told." He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of gathering arguments, the quiet of giving weight to what she had said, of taking the time to receive it properly rather than moving immediately past it to what he already knew. "Have you ever felt different?" he said. "On mornings after you consumed less of it?" The question landed with a precision that stopped her entirely. Because yes, she had felt different on those mornings. She had felt the warmth in her chest pressing harder. She had felt her senses sharpen at the edges in a way they usually did not. She had dismissed it each time as imagination, as the specific cruelty of a body that could mimic the feeling of something real without producing it. She had blamed herself for hoping. She looked at her hands in the dim light. "Sometimes," she said carefully. "More than sometimes, I think," he said. Not an accusation. A door, held slightly open. She raised her eyes. "What do you know about it?" He told her. He told her with the same clarity he would have used telling anyone anything true and serious and impossible to soften without destroying the accuracy of it. The tonic was not a nutritional supplement. It was not a blood support for a wolf with low development. It was a silver-based neural suppression agent, a compound classified under Eastern Accords Pack welfare law as an unauthorized intervention because it did not support wolf function. It prevented it. It interfered with the communication pathway between the wolf and the human mind. It blocked shifting. It suppressed instinct over time. It did not eliminate a wolf. It buried her, buried her, buried her, and left her alive enough to keep pressing, or deep beneath the compound and the years and the story everyone around her had agreed to believe. Avena's jaw moved, one small involuntary motion, side to side, which she stopped immediately. Her hands curled at the knuckles. She pressed her back against the wall, not retreating, bracing, the way a person braces when the ground shifts under them and they need something solid behind them to take the additional weight. "My wolf is not gone," she said slowly. The words came out one by one, each one tested before it was placed. "She has never been gone." "No," he said. "She has been held down. That is not the same country." The wolf in her chest pressed so hard against her ribs that she brought her hand up automatically and pressed back. The warmth was intense, not painful, but enormous, or like a room that had been dark for years, with one lamp finally bright in the center of it. 5 years, she said. He did not fill the silence. He let her have the space to carry the weight of it at her own pace. 5 years. 5 years of being told she was defective. 5 years of the Omega designation and the labor yard and the cold east wing and the looks that slid past her and the name they gave her pressed into every interaction until it stopped feeling like an insult and started feeling like a fact. 5 years of her wolf pressing against the inside of her chest every single morning and being told that what she felt was a phantom. 5 years of knowing something was wrong and not being able to name it. because the person who named things in Duskmere was Jarex Lockmere, and Jarex Lockmere had named her Omega, had named her defective, what had named her manageable and small and without standing. "Why?" she said. The word came out flat and direct. "Why would he? What did he gain?" "Your bloodline," he said. "You carry 7 generations of founding wolf lineage in the eastern reaches. A fully awoken wolf of founding blood is not a wolf a pack lord can govern without her permission. You were not a liability, Avena. You were the most powerful thing in his compound." That was the problem. She sat with this for a long moment. The room was cold and dim and absolutely quiet, and in the quiet she could feel her wolf pressing steadily, like a tide coming in after years of being held artificially at low. "I need to show you something," Elric said, "and I need your permission to step closer." She looked at him, the pale winter eyes, steady and entirely present. He was not performing steadiness. This was simply what he was, a man whose interior life had arrived at a certainty and was not in conflict with itself about it. "All right," she said. He moved across the floor and crouched in front of her. Not standing, crouching, eyes level with hers, and raised his hand, palm outward, between them, asking. Not touching, asking. She looked at his open hand. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached out and closed her fingers around his wrist. The response from her wolf was immediate and enormous. She made a sound in the back of her throat, startled, and her grip tightened involuntarily. The warmth in her chest expanded outward from the point of contact. Not painful, but staggering, like a window blowing open in a room that had been sealed for years and finally filling with fresh air. Elric held completely still. His pulse was even under her fingers. "She heard you," he said quietly. "At close range, a suppressed wolf will still respond to a lichen bond. That is not something she does with a stranger." Avena looked at their hands. Then she looked up at his face. "What does that mean?" she asked. Her voice was very careful. "It means you are my mate," he said. "And it means I have been searching for you for 4 years. I have followed this compound signature across 6 other packs. I knew what I would find when I arrived here. I knew the compound would be in the East Wing. I knew she would be a wolf who had been pressed down so long she had nearly stopped believing in herself." He held her gaze steadily. "I knew all of that. But I did not know you, and there is a difference between the search and the person at the end of it." She pulled her hand back slowly. She looked at the far wall for a long time. Outside the narrow window, the night was a dark blue-grey, the overcast sky pressing low and soft over Duskmere's compound. She could hear the night patrol in the outer yard. She could hear her own breathing, and underneath it, the warmth in her chest, no longer pressing in desperation, but pressing with a different quality now, the quality of something that has been heard, finally, and does not need to shout. "You do not know me," she said. "No," he said. "Not yet. But I know what was done to you, and I know your wolf has been fighting since the first dose. She is stronger than 5 years of suppression, Avena. She is stronger than every name they called her and every story they told to make the name stick." A pause. "She has been talking to you this entire time, the warmth in your chest every morning, the days when you ate less of the meal because something in you knew not to. The way she pressed hardest on the worst nights, staying present, refusing to be fully buried. That was not a phantom. That was her. She has never left you." Avena looked down at her own hands, the calloused, careful hands of a woman who had been doing her own surviving, the mended sleeve hands, the slightly enlarged right knuckle, the hands that had pressed flat against cold earth that morning with the practiced stillness of someone who had made an expertise of endurance. She turned her palms upward in her lap and looked at them, what the warmth in her chest pressed steadily, like a fire that someone had spent 5 years pouring water on, and that had burned through every drop. Elwyn Valecrest reported to her father at the second bell of morning. She stood in the doorway of his study, not entering, which was a habit she had maintained since childhood, the habit of someone who understood that the spaces belonging to Jarek's Lochmere were his spaces, and entry was by invitation, and delivered what she had seen with the neutral precision of a woman who had learned that information was its own kind of currency, and that how you spent it defined the return. The Eternal King had gone below stairs at the 11th hour. He had taken the servants' corridor. He had been in the East Wing for 40 minutes. Now Jarek's Lochmere sat at his desk and was quiet for a moment after she finished. He was a man of middle age, broad and controlled, with the specific stillness of someone who processed everything before he responded to anything. His study was immaculate, papers in precise order, the fire laid but not overly generous, every object in the room placed where it would be found, exactly where he left it. He ran his compound with the same principle. Everything in its designated position, everything serving its designated function, no waste of resources, no tolerance for friction. Avenna Ironwood had been designated a resource. She had been assigned a function. She had been managed accordingly. The Eternal King had visited her room for 40 minutes. Jarex sat with this arithmetic and worked through what it produced. Avena could, if she chose, give an account of 5 years in this compound that Jarex could counter only with denial. Denial against a witness's account, with Crown officials present, was a different calculation than denial in a pack where everyone with knowledge of the situation had reasons to stay quiet. His reasons, the Covenant Papers, the Collective Liability Clause, Valor Thornfield's secondary provision that bound every wolf in Duskmere under the financial consequences of exposure, had kept the pack's senior members quiet for 5 years. No one who knew about the tonic's composition was going to report it, because reporting it triggered a mechanism that fell on all of them. He reached for the Covenant Papers, read through the secondary clause. The specific language, any voluntary disclosure to Crown authority activates collective financial liability. Could he had held this over the senior wolves for 5 years? They had stayed quiet for 5 years. The system had worked. He did not yet know that the system had a gap. He did not yet know that 6 weeks ago, a Crown financial agent had purchased the entire outstanding covenant from Valor Thornfield's company. Every clause, every provision, every mechanism, at full face value in Crown coin, and that the papers he was currently reading were legally inert, had been inert for 6 weeks, and would remain inert regardless of what he did with them next. He did not know that the weapon he had spent 5 years building had been quietly disarmed before he arrived at the room where he kept it. He made his plan. But the House Conduct provision allowed a pack alpha to call a formal assembly around a dependent member who had departed assigned quarters without authorization and made unauthorized contact with a visiting delegate. He had used this provision on Avena 8 times in 5 years. He knew its language. He knew its procedures. He knew how to deploy it in a room full of witnesses in a way that made a 22-year-old Omega girl sound unreliable, unstable, and incapable of credible testimony. He would call the assembly at the 8th bell. He would present this as an unfortunate but necessary conduct review. He would use Virel Winford's name without consulting her. He would use the language of concern, her condition, her limitations, the difficulty of managing a wolf who cannot distinguish between imagination and reality. He would do it in front of the Eternal King's territorial witnesses, because the territorial witnesses would write reports, and the reports would enter the Crown Record, and the Crown Record would reflect that Avenna Ironwood of Duskmere Pack had a documented history of instability, and should not be treated as a reliable source on any matter pertaining to her time in this compound. It was a clean plan. Jarek's plans were always clean. He called his younger daughter in after Elwyn left. Nixel Lockmere was 18, quick-minded, and she had spent her entire life watching her father make decisions that she privately assessed as flawed, but that she had never said aloud. Because the cost of saying them aloud was always paid by someone else. She sat across from him and listened to the plan with her face composed and her hands folded in her lap, the posture of a young woman who was very good at looking neutral. She asked the question at the end. What if she is his mate? Jarek dismissed it without looking up from the papers. No working wolf, no bond, no standing. The claim would require a confirmed wolf response, and they both knew Avena had no wolf response to confirm. The claim would fall apart the moment it was examined. He moved on. Nixel looked at the window. She did not say anything more. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. But when she left the study and walked back toward her room in the pre-dawn quiet of the pack house, she did not sleep. Or she sat in the dark of her own room with her eyes open and thought about the Eternal King's head turning toward the east wing as he crossed the gate. She had been standing at her father's side during the arrival, and she had seen it. The precise, certain orientation of someone who already knew where to look. She thought about what that meant. She kept thinking about it until the 8th bell rang, and the pack began assembling in the outer yard, and by then it was too late to do anything but watch. The formal summons came to Avena's door at the 4th bell. The head enforcer knocked twice, which was the courtesy notice, and slid the formal conduct paper under the door, which was the procedure. While she picked it up from the floor and read it with the same careful attention she gave everything written by anyone with authority in this compound. Not for content, because she already knew what it would say, but for phrasing, for any variation from the standard text, for anything that indicated this instance was different from the previous 8. It was not different. She set it on the edge of the pallet and went to the small basin to wash her face. Cold water every morning. The east wing's pipe ran from an unheated exterior line that did not warm until late afternoon. She had learned to move quickly through cold water instead of bracing against it. Quick and certain, like most things that could not be changed. She dressed carefully. Her second-best labor dress, the one with no visible mending, the one whose hem sat correctly. She bound her hair in the braid. She thought about shoes, and then thought about the cold stone of the yard and put them on. Small, practical decisions assembled one after another. She pressed her palm against her sternum one time, standing in the middle of the room, and felt the warmth there, steadier than it had been in years, pressing with a consistency and force she had not felt since the early days before the compound took full hold. Her wolf, awake and oriented and pressing forward with something that felt less like distress and more like intention. I know, Avena thought, not knowing what she was acknowledging exactly, but acknowledging something. She went to the door and opened it. The 2 senior enforcers waited in the corridor. She walked between them toward the yard on her own feet. Elric was already in the yard. He had been there before the first pack member arrived, standing in the covered walkway at the yard's north edge, far back enough to be in shadow, still enough to be easy to miss. Torin stood at his right shoulder. Neither of them had spoken since they took their positions 40 minutes before the assembly was called. Torin had seen the summons notice go under Avena's door. He had come directly to Elric's room and knocked once. Elric had already been dressed. He had already known. "He called the assembly," Torin said, when they reached the walkway. "I know. The territorial witnesses from Ruel Ashcroft's delegation will be present." "Good." Torin looked at him. After 12 years, he had developed a precise read of the king's quality of stillness. There were several distinct varieties, and this one was the kind that came not from restraint, but from absolute, settled decision. Elric had made the choice. He was simply waiting for the architecture of the moment to reach the point where it was his turn to speak. Torin turned back to the yard and held his own silence, which was, at times, the most valuable thing he offered. The pack assembled in the pattern Avena had described to Elric the night before. The senior wolves at the yard's inner edge, the enforcers at the perimeter, the working pack members filling the space between. Not crowding, maintaining the specific distance of people who wanted to see but did not want to be seen as interested. The cold morning air carried the smell of frost and packed earth and the formal wool of 30 people who had been told to present themselves correctly. Orkalira Lockmere stood to her husband's left. Elowyn stood on the upper walkway above the yard, a little apart, her expression doing complicated work that she was almost succeeding in keeping off her face. Nixel, Avena noticed when she crossed the yard, was standing slightly behind the main formation rather than within it. Her arms were crossed against the cold. She was watching the north edge of the yard. She was watching Elric. He had not moved. He was still in the shadow of the covered walkway, and the only reason Nixel was looking at that shadow was that she already knew he was there, which meant she had been watching for him, which meant something. Avena had no time to think about what it meant. The enforcers brought her to the yard centre and stepped back. Jarex Lockmere stood before her, with the practiced calm of a man who had conducted this procedure 8 times and found it straightforward. He used the formal language, clean, procedural, each word chosen for the record it would create. Unauthorized departure from assigned quarters, unauthorized contact with a crown delegate, spreading unverified personal accounts to those without context for her condition. She looked at the ground while he spoke, not because she was broken, because she was calculating. She was listening to every word of what he said with the same precise attention she had always given to the language of people with authority over her, and she was filing each item into the accounting she had been running since her 18th year. Jarex produced the enforcement rod. The yard, which had not been silent, went silent. He moved to step behind her. Elric walked out of the shadow. He did not hurry. He did not have to. He moved across the yard at a pace that had the quality of something inevitable. Not performed inevitability. Not the deliberate drama of entrance, but the actual inevitability of weather. A front arriving across a valley. Present because it was always going to be present, arriving when it was ready. And the valley's preparations, or lack of them, were not relevant to the weather's schedule. The pack parted for him without being asked, not from ceremony, from the deep biological response to something older and larger than social rank, a wolf authority that did not require declaration because it was already in the air, in the ground, in the weight of his step on the cold cobblestones. Or the enforcers at the yard's perimeter stepped back without instruction. The senior wolves nearest the centre moved slightly outward. He stopped 6 feet from Jarex Lockmere. His voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet. It carried precisely as far as he needed it to carry, which was to every edge of the yard and no further. "Lower your hand," he said, "and answer to the crown, or raise it, and answer to me." The yard was completely still, the specific stillness of 30 people holding their breath in unison, all of them doing the same rapid assessment of the same set of facts, all of them arriving at the same answer, which was, "The geometry of this morning has changed." Jarex did not lower his hand. He was too practiced at control to let his hand move in response to instruction from someone he was not yet prepared to acknowledge as having authority over this matter. He raised his chin slightly instead. "This is a pack conduct matter under pack law authority," he said. "The Crown does not have standing in internal discipline proceedings." "She is my mate," Elric said. Those 4 words landed in the cold air like stones dropped from a considerable height. The silence after them was different from the silence before. Thicker. The silence of 30 wolves doing a calculation that was not arithmetic, but something more fundamental. Something that operated below the level of rank and law and procedure. The recognition that a mate claim from a bonded king was not a statement that could be weighed against pack conduct authority, because it did not occupy the same category. Jarex's jaw tightened. He looked at Avena, not at Elric, at Avena, with the expression of a man who had just watched a tool he maintained for 5 years develop a function he did not intend. "She has no working wolf," he said. His voice was even, controlled. "No working wolf, no bond, no standing for the claim." "Her wolf," Elric said, "is present, awake, and was suppressed for 5 years by a silver-based neural compound administered without her knowledge or consent. The compound's chemical classification, under Section 4 of Eastern Accord's Pack Welfare Law, constitutes unauthorized intervention. The quantities in your purchase records, 5 years of documentation in your own handwriting, are consistent with daily maintenance dosing of 1 individual at the exact concentration required to prevent shifting while maintaining the appearance of a genetically defective wolf." He reached into his coat and produced folded papers. "Her blood was analyzed by my medical advisor on the night of my arrival. The compound was identified, classified, and documented. The purchase records were obtained from your apothecary supplier's archive by Crown financial agents 6 weeks before this delegation arrived." He held the papers. "Or the covenant you hold with Vela Thornfield's company, the secondary liability clause you have been using for 5 years to keep every wolf in this compound quiet, was purchased by the Crown at full face value 6 weeks ago. Every clause, every provision, every mechanism you built to protect yourself." He placed the papers in the mud at Jarex's feet. "The weapon you spent 5 years building," he said quietly, "has been sitting in a Crown vault, inert, since before you knew we were coming." He shifted. Not the full form. The half form that only the eternal king could hold. The form that was a man who had chosen not to become the storm, and whose restraint made the storm feel larger than any full expression could. His height increased slightly. The bones of his jaw altered. His eyes illuminated, not reflecting the cold morning light, but generating their own, a pale silver white that was entirely steady, entirely deliberate. His hands changed slightly at the fingers. The cobblestones beneath his feet cracked in a clean line, extending 4 feet in each direction. Every wolf in the yard went to one knee, not from instruction, not from choice, from something older than politics, older than pack hierarchy, older than any system of authority that had been assembled in the years since wolves first walked in human form. The biological, bone-level recognition of a wolf whose authority was so old it was simply part of how the world was ordered. Every wolf, all 30. Jarex Lockmere stayed standing, but 1 foot moved backward on the stone, a single, involuntary slide, a half step he didn't choose, and in the yard's complete stillness, It was the loudest thing that happened. Elric allowed the half-form to recede, slowly, without ceremony. He crossed the yard to where Avena was kneeling on the cold cobblestones, and he crouched in front of her, not standing over, crouching, eyes level with hers, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the full, unperformed attention of someone who had come a very long way to find exactly this. She raised her head. Her eyes were dry. They were very clear. What was in them was not gratitude, not relief, not the softness of being saved. It was harder than that, and more valuable. The expression of a person who has been carrying a weight for so long that the first moment someone else puts a hand on it feels less like rescue and more like confirmation. Confirmation that the weight was real, that someone else could feel it, that she had not been wrong about it for 5 years. She had not been wrong, not about any of it. "Get up," he said. Not a command, a door held open, waiting. She got up. He put his arm around her shoulders, steady and solid and warm, the simple warmth of a body that had no intention of moving, and turned to face the yard. "I am calling a formal tribunal," he said. His voice was even and complete. "Every territorial witness present will serve as record. No one leaves Duskmere until it concludes." No one argued. In the cold morning yard, on the cracked cobblestones, or with Avena standing at the Eternal King's side for the first time since she had arrived in this compound as a 17-year-old girl with 7 generations of founding blood and a wolf who had been pressing against her ribs every day since, no one in Duskmere Pack argued. Elwyn, on the upper walkway, looked at the table railing in front of her. Her hands were very still. Nixel, from the edge of the formation, looked at Avena. Not at the king, at Avena, with the specific expression of a young woman who had asked a question at the second bell of morning and had just received the answer. The pack house's great chamber was reconfigured by Torin Crowell by mid-morning. He did it with the efficiency of a man who had assembled tribunal rooms before and understood that the physical arrangement of a space was its own form of argument, or the horseshoe of tables placed authority at the open end and accountability at the center. The witnesses needed to be able to see both the evidence and the person it implicated simultaneously. The separation of Elwyn and Nixel from their father by deliberate empty seats was not casual. Nothing about the room was casual. Elric sat at the open head of the horseshoe, Torin to his right with the evidence satchel closed. 3 territorial witness representatives along the left arm, the woman from Ruel Ashcroft's delegation, a senior pack assessor from the northern reaches, and the Crown's formal record keeper. Jarex Lochmere sat at the center of the horseshoe's curve, flanked by Crown guards in the quiet, immovable way that made it clear that the guards were not decorative. Elwyn and Nixel in separate seats along the right arm, though separated from their father by 2 empty chairs that made the separation look like a judgment. Virel Winford sat apart from everyone, against the south wall. She was 62 years old, the pack healer for 20 years, a woman who had given her professional name to a compound she had never analyzed because she was shown a label she had no reason to question by a man who had every reason to falsify it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at no one in particular, which was the expression of a woman who was currently engaged in the specific, painful work of recounting 5 years of her own conduct through a lens that had just been significantly and permanently altered. Avena sat against the right wall behind Elric's shoulder, present as witness and subject of record. Not at the horseshoe, that was Torin's decision, and it was the right one. The people at the horseshoe would perform their proceedings and make their arguments and present their evidence. Avena would watch it. This was, Torin had explained to her privately before the chamber filled, the first time in 5 years that what happened to her would be determined by something other than Jarex Lockmere's convenience. She had sat with that sentence for a moment. Then she had walked into the chamber and taken her chair. Torin Crowell was not a loud man. He was not a dramatic man. He presented the evidence in 3 sequenced sections with the practiced economy of someone who understood that the facts themselves were the argument, and that his job was simply to arrange them in the order that let them be heard most clearly. The first section, the compound, purchase orders. 11 transactions across 5 years, written in Jarex Lockmere's hand, cross-referenced against the apothecary supplier's archive. Quantities consistent with daily maintenance dosing of one individual at a specific concentration. A concentration which Torin named with its formal chemical classification under Eastern Accords Pack welfare law. The classification carried 3 words: unauthorized silver intervention. He read those words with no inflection and no pause, because they did not need decoration. He read Virel Winford's signed statement into the record. She had not been consulted about a tonic for Avenna Ironwood. She had been shown a falsified label. The label she was shown identified the compound as an iron supplement with trace mineral support. She had signed off on it without analysis because she had no reason to doubt the Alpha's characterization of a supplement for a genetically defective pack member with chronic low energy. She was deceived, Torin said, and his voice carried equal weight on both words. Then he read Dalen Westmore's blood analysis. The compound identified, classified, and quantified. The concentration consistent with 5 years of daily dosing. The documented effect on the lichen neural pathway at that concentration. Complete prevention of shifting. Significant suppression of wolf instinct. Partial suppression of bond recognition. The reversal timeline once dosing ceased, approximately 3 to 4 months, for full neural clarity. 3 to 4 months. Avena looked at her hands, flat on her knees. Across the room, at her seat against the south wall, Virel Winford looked at Avena with the expression of a woman who understood something she wished she had understood 5 years ago, and was sitting inside that understanding without looking away from it, without the comfort of telling herself there had been nothing she could have done. There had been things she could have done. She had not done them. She was sitting in the room where that accounting was due. When Torin completed the first section, the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when the air has been changed by something that cannot be unchanged. The second section, the financials, the failed Eastern harvest in the year Avena turned 17, the reparation debt from the border skirmish the previous spring, the treasury gap that opened between them and the options Jarex had available for closing it, or the covenant with Vela Thornfield's company, the primary terms, and then the secondary clause, which Torin read in full, including the specific language binding every wolf in Duskmere Pack as collective liability in the event of voluntary disclosure to Crown authority. The territorial witness from Ruel Ashcroft's delegation leaned forward when the secondary clause was read aloud. She read it again when Torin set the paper down. She sat back slowly, with the expression of a woman who had understood a mechanism and found it repellent. Then Torin presented the Crown's purchase documentation. The covenant had been acquired by Crown financial agents 6 weeks before the delegation departed the Ashen Throne. Full face value, every clause, every provision. What the purchase had been completed and registered with the Eastern Accords Financial Authority before the first census paperwork was filed. The mechanism by which this compound's administration was maintained in secrecy for 5 years, Torin said quietly, was rendered inoperative 6 weeks ago. The pack members whose silence was purchased by collective threat were no longer under that threat when this delegation arrived. They were simply not aware that they were no longer under it. He set the purchase document down. Jarex had not moved throughout the financials. He sat with his hands on the table in front of him, flat, still, the posture of a man who had built a structure he believed was permanent, and was watching someone remove the walls one by one, and who was calculating, even now, that whether there was a wall left somewhere that he had not yet seen removed. There was not. The third section, the bloodline. Avena's Omega designation, formally recorded in the Pack Council, minutes 5 years prior. The language of the designation, which cited absence of demonstrable wolf capacity, inability to shift, chronic deficiency in lichen instinct. The formal criteria for an Omega designation under Pack law, which required independent medical verification of wolf failure from a licensed Pack healer without prior relationship to the designating alpha. No such verification had been obtained. Cross-referenced against Avena's bloodline documentation, 7 generations of founding wolf lineage in the eastern reaches, on both her mother's and father's lines. The founding blood classification under Pack law, which granted protected status, labor rights, and Pack standing, that could not be revoked without formal council review and independent verification. None of these protections had been observed. The Omega designation applied to Avenna Ironwood, Torin said, was not a finding. It was a fabrication. It stripped her of standing she was entitled to by birth, using criteria that were manufactured by the same administration that manufactured the conditions appearing to justify them. He closed the evidence satchel. The room was as quiet as the room where people have heard the worst thing they expected to hear, and found it was worse than they expected. Jarex spoke last. He had been allowed to speak because Elric had offered it, not from courtesy, but from the understanding that a man who was not given the chance to defend himself could claim the defense was the point. Jarex stood, and he was steady, and his voice was controlled, and what he said was, "I kept this pack alive. Every decision I made for this pack's survival. The harvest failed. The reparation debt was due. I had obligations I could not meet with the resources available to me. Everything I did to keep this pack standing." He sat down. Elric looked at him across the horseshoe for a moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was quiet and complete and on the record, and he did not look away from Jarex as he said it. "You had a daughter of the founding blood in your care. She came to you at 17 with a wolf that was already among the most powerful in this territory. You spent 5 years making her disappear so your debts stayed hidden and your authority stayed unchallenged." A pause. A pack is not kept alive by destroying the people inside it. It is merely kept. There is a difference between survival and preservation, and what you chose to preserve was not this pack. It was your control of it. The silence after that was the silence of everyone in the room who had heard the wrong thing defended with the wrong certainty, and had nothing adequate to answer. Because there was nothing adequate to answer. Because the wrong thing had been defended so many times in this compound and others like it, with the same language of necessity and sacrifice, and the difficult choices of leadership, and it had always been the people least in a position to refuse who bore the weight of those difficult choices. And Eloin Veilcrest didn't look at her father when the formal charges were read. She looked at the table in front of her, and her hands were very still, and she didn't look up until the Crown Guards moved to place the restraints on Jarex Lockmere's wrists. And then she did not look at her father. She looked at Avena, across the room, against the right wall. She held the look for 3 full seconds. It was not an apology. It was not a request for absolution. It was acknowledgement the specific, minimal, most honest thing Elwyn Valecrest had ever done in a room full of people watching. The acknowledgement that she had known something was wrong and told herself it was not her matter, and that she had been wrong about that, and that she was going to sit in that wrongness without asking anyone to tell her it was all right. Avena looked back at her. Filed it. True. Jarax was led from the chamber with his eyes forward. He did not look at Avena. Not once. Not when he passed 2 feet from where she sat. Not when he reached the door. He kept his eyes on the middle distance and walked through the door and was gone. The room took a collective breath. Avena pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed through the thing that arrived. Not triumph, not relief, not grief. The specific, hard-edged thing that comes when a truth you have known in your body for 5 years is finally said aloud in a room full of witnesses and written into a formal record that will exist after today. The ache of a thing being true, at last, in full sight, where it cannot be denied or minimized or absorbed back into the story of someone else's convenience. She breathed. She let the ache be what it was. She was still there. She had always been here. The delegation departed Duskmere 3 days after the tribunal. Avena stood at the outer gate as the horses were being prepared and looked at the road running south. She looked at it for a long time. The road that went back through the eastern territories, through the communities where the name Ironwood was known as founding blood, through the spaces where she might, with the tribunal's record behind her and the compound clearing from her blood, day by day, have built something. It was not impossible. People had started from less. She turned and looked at the road running north, toward the mountains, toward the ashen throne, toward a man who had crouched on the cold cobblestones of this yard and held her gaze without flinching, and placed the covenant papers in the mud and said, "Get up," like it was an opening and not an instruction. Elric was at her shoulder. He had been there since she walked out of the labor quarters with her single bag, the same grey wool bag she had arrived with at 17, which told you something specific about the accumulation available to a person the compound had named without standing. He had taken the bag from her without asking, and had not given it back, which she had allowed on the basis that it was a small thing, and she was conserving her resistance for larger questions. "You do not have to decide today," he said. "I know," she said. "I already decided." She got on the horse. She did not look back when they crossed the outer gate. Not from drama, or from the same practical certainty she applied to most things. Duskmere held nothing she needed anymore, and looking backward at things that held nothing was a use of attention she had learned to stop making. The road ran north. The mountains rose ahead, pale granite and old pine, and the specific, clean, cold air of elevation that she had never breathed before, and that felt, in her lungs, like a first breath of something that had always been available but had been kept just out of reach. Her wolf pressed steadily in her chest, oriented forward. Forward, Avena thought. She had not been oriented forward in 5 years. The palace of the Ashen Throne rose from the mountain like something that had grown there. Pale granite in the same pale color as the surrounding stone. Tall windows that caught the morning light and returned it as warmth, or the kind of building that had been standing long enough to have become part of the landscape rather than a thing placed on it. It was very large. Avena, who had spent 5 years in the east wing of a compound where the rooms were calculated to fit their designated function and nothing more, looked at the height of it and felt something she identified, after a moment's reflection, as the specific unease of a person who had been in small spaces for so long that large ones felt like a kind of exposure. She would adjust. She was extremely good at adjusting. Iskira Gravesend, not related to Rykeron, she clarified this in a crisp, neutral tone on the first morning without being asked, which Avena appreciated, brought her tea without being asked, and knocked before entering, and said good morning without requiring a response. At the eastern suite had high windows, and a fire wide enough to stand in, and sheets changed every third morning, with the unannounced efficiency of a household that ran on considered routine rather than performed ceremony. On the first night, Avena woke in the dark at the 3rd hour and sat bolt upright with her heart doing the threat pattern response that 5 years of light sleeping had made automatic. It took 30 seconds for her body to update, for her eyes to take in the high windows and the wide fire, and the fact that the room had a lock she had tested from the inside twice the previous evening, and that the lock held, and that the door was where she had left it. She lay back down. She stared at the ceiling. "You are not in Duskmere," she told herself. Not as comfort, as information. She got up at the 4th bell, which was when she had always gotten up, because some things needed time to unlearn, and she was not going to rush the unlearning. She went to the window and watched the mountain in the dark, and by the time the sky began to lighten behind the eastern peak, the warmth in her chest was steady, and the breath came evenly, and she was more or less all right. More or less all right. For now, that was enough. Elric appeared at meals when she wanted company. He was absent when she did not. He knocked before entering any room she occupied, waited for her voice before the door moved, and moved at a pace through the palace's social geography that was entirely keyed to what she wanted, at what speed she wanted it. He did not explain this behavior. He did not name it. He simply did it with the same quiet consistency as everything else he did, which was the quality about him that Avena had begun, cautiously, to file under reliable. In the 3rd week, Torin appeared at the sitting room door with a wooden crate and set it down without preamble. Wolf biology, lichen history, biochemistry of silver suppression and reversal, pack law history for the eastern reaches going back 400 years. He moved the crate 1 inch to the left, squaring it against the wall. 3 more cases in the East Library if you want them. The catalogue is inside. He left without elaboration. She had everything read within 2 weeks. She sent back through Iskira a list of 7 additional titles she had identified in the footnotes of the biochemistry text that she wanted access to. Torin delivered them the following morning, with the expression of a man who had expected exactly this. And in the 4th week, Elric asked her if she wanted to work in the East Courtyard in the mornings. He did not call it training. He called it morning practice, which was different. Training implied a deficiency to be corrected. Practice implied a skill being developed. "Your wolf has been speaking to you your entire life," he told her on the 3rd morning, when they were sitting across from each other on the cold stones with their eyes closed. The cold feeling before something bad arrived. The instinct on the mornings you ate less of the meal. The warmth in your chest that you dismissed for 5 years as imagination. That was not imagination. That was her. She was telling you what she knew, and she was right every time. Avena opened her eyes. She knew about the compound, she said. Not a question. She knew something was wrong with the food on the days you consumed less of it, he said. She was protecting you with everything available to her, which was not much. She had no voice. She had no form. She had only instinct, and she used every bit of it. Avena looked at the mountain above the courtyard wall. The morning was clear, the kind of winter clear that made the air feel made of glass, every edge sharp and present and real. She thought about 17. She thought about the first tonic, the first morning, the feeling in her chest pressing harder than usual that day, the day she had eaten only half the meal because something in her did not want the rest, and she had called it anxiety and moved on. She had not been wrong. She had been right about it. She had been right about all of it, every single day for 5 years, and the world around her had assembled itself to say otherwise, and she had almost believed the world. Almost. She never gave up, Avena said. No, he said. Neither did you. The silver cleared from her blood fastest. Her system, finally free of the compound's daily maintenance dose, began moving the accumulated chemical through her liver and out within the first 2 weeks. Dalen Westmore confirmed this at the end of week 3, producing his analysis charts with the careful manner of a man who understood that he was not just reporting biochemical data, but tracking the specific, measurable evidence of a person returning to themselves. Bone marrow took longer. The connective tissue around her ribs, the tissue that was closest to where her wolf lived, and that had been compressed against the suppression for 5 years, was the slowest of all. As it cleared, she experienced what Dalen had warned her about: pressure headaches on full moon nights, arriving without warning and subsiding without warning, a cold sensitivity along her forearms that appeared in the 2nd month and faded in the 3rd. Episodes of vivid wolf awareness that arrived like sudden weather, sharp, complete, present for 20 minutes, and then gone, leaving her slightly breathless and extremely awake. She was never alone in any of it. Not because Elric sat with her and said things, because he sat with her, and didn't require her to perform recovery at any pace other than her actual pace. He had no investment in her healing being dramatic or visible, or on a schedule that made it comfortable for anyone else. He was simply present, steady, the way mountains are present, not from effort, but because that is what they are. She had not trusted steadiness in 5 years. She had been afraid to, because everything she had previously trusted had been weaponized against her. But steadiness repeated over time without condition eventually registers, even in a body that has been taught not to register it. Slowly, carefully, the way something long compressed expands when the pressure is finally released, not all at once, but incrementally, cell by cell, Avena began to trust the space she was in. She began to trust him. The evening it became real was not dramatic. 6th week, evening after practice. Both of them sitting in the east courtyard with their backs against the stone wall and their shoulders almost touching, watching the moon clear the mountain's shoulder. The torches had burned to embers. The mountain air was cold and still and smelled of pine and ice water and the particular mineral sharpness of granite in winter. He said nothing. She said nothing. The silence between them had been, for the first weeks, an empty thing. She had filled it privately with assessment and calculation, the background hum of a mind that had been operating in survival mode for years, and did not know yet how to let it go quiet. But the silence was different tonight. It had a different quality. Warm, easy, the specific quality of a silence that does not belong to one person or the other, but to both of them together. A shared space neither of them needed to fill or defend or perform inside. She noticed it. She sat inside it and noticed that she was not afraid. Or she had not been not afraid in a silence with another person in 5 years. She did not say anything. She did not name it. She let it be what it was, this small, quietly enormous thing, a silence in which she was at ease, in which she did not need to calculate, in which the warmth in her chest was simply warm and not a warning and not a question, a silence that felt like breathing after years of bracing. At her shoulder, Elric sat and watched the moon without requiring anything from the evening except the evening. She leaned her shoulder slightly against his. He did not move, did not comment, did not make it into something that needed to be named. Simply was there, warm and solid, and entirely present. The moon cleared the mountain. The stars appeared one by one, and Avenna Ironwood, in the cold east courtyard of the Ashen Throne, quietly, without announcement, began to let herself want something good. Month 3. Full moon. The frost had arrived the previous night, and the east courtyard stones were coated in a thin, precise layer of ice that made the surface look like frosted glass, every crack and seam filled with the season's first real cold. They had been sitting in practice position for an hour. It was the longest she had ever held it. The position required sustained, deliberate communication between her mind and the wolf beneath it. A quiet offering of space, rather than the reaching and pressing that felt more natural to someone who had been trying to get through a closed door for years. It was not reaching that worked. It was the opposite of reaching. It was the act of being open, staying present, letting the wolf feel that the space was safe and that the door was not locked anymore. It had never been locked. That was the thing. The compound had been the lock, and the compound was gone. Her wolf was not pressing anymore. She was not pressing because there was nothing to press against. She was simply close, closer than she had been in 3 months of clearing, closer than she had been in 5 years of suppression. Pressing softly, like a fire that has found its kindling and is no longer fighting for oxygen. The membrane gave. It did not rupture. It did not break. It simply opened, the way a window opens when the catch is released and the air outside finds its way in. From one breath to the next. 19 seconds. She would count them later, in the reconstruction, because she had been counting everything since she was 17, and she was not going to stop now. 1. The warmth expanded from her chest outward through her ribs. 7. The cold stone was no longer cold through her palms. 13. Something moved in her bones. Not painful, not frightening. The movement of deep structure rearranging into the shape it had always been meant to be, the shape it had held in potential for 22 years, compressed and patient, and waiting for the lock to open. 19. Where she had been sitting, a wolf stood on the frost-covered stones, dark gold, the color of old amber held up to late afternoon light, warm, deep, luminous, the specific color of something that had been pressed and compressed and had emerged with more richness for it, the way amber is richer for the time it spent becoming what it is. Her eyes were the clear, pale gray of early winter sky, the sky you see on a cold, clean morning when the clouds have cleared and the horizon is sharp. She was larger than a common wolf, the size that 7 generations of founding blood produces when it has been compressed for 5 years and is finally given room, enormous and still, a form that had been waiting in the exact dimensions it needed. She stood on the frosted stones and breathed the mountain air, and was, for the first time in her life, exactly what she had always been. Elric had not moved. He was sitting in the same position he had been in for the past hour, and he sat in it now, with the perfect, absolute stillness of someone who understood what they were seeing, and did not want to disturb a single second of it. His eyes were bright in the moonlight. His hands were flat on the frost. She turned and looked at him. He lowered himself onto his knees on the cold stone, both palms flat against the frost. He bowed his head, not in ceremony, not in performance, in recognition. The eternal king of the Ashen Throne, on the stones of his own courtyard, going to his knees for the wolf who had survived 5 years of burial and arrived, at last, at the surface. She walked to him on gold paws. She touched her nose to his cheek. He exhaled, long, slow, complete. The release of something he had been holding since a seer named Orlena Ravenport sat across from him in a winter storm 4 years ago, and told him what he was looking for. The release of the search, as the release of the 6 wrong packs, and the 7 trails, and the years of following a signature through the eastern reaches with the specific, patient weight of someone who knows the right place, exists and has not found it yet. He had found it. "There you are," he said quietly, into the frost and the moonlight and the mountain cold. "I have been looking for you for a very long time." She pressed her head against his, warm and solid and entirely herself, and the east courtyard of the Ashen Throne was very quiet and very still, and in the quiet there was nothing but the mountain and the moon, and the two of them arrived at last at the place the search had always been moving toward. 14 days later, full moon, the Ashen Grove. The grove sat a 1/4 mile from the palace gate, or along a stone path that wound through ancient pine and silver birch, trees that had been standing since the throne's founding, their bark pale and their branches holding the first real snow of the season in careful accumulations that caught the torchlight and returned it in warm flickers. 100 iron-bracketed torches had been placed along the path and around the ceremonial circle at the grove's center. The full moon cleared the tree line as the ceremony hour approached, adding its cold silver to the warmth of the torches, and the grove was lit with 2 kinds of light that did not conflict but combined, the fire's warmth and the moon's clarity. Together, the entire pack was assembled. Elric's household guard in ash-grey livery, rank marks precise, bearing correct. The senior council at the inner edge of the stone circle, Thorin to the left of the center altar stone, hands behind his back, the small real warmth on his face that he would have denied about if asked, and that was entirely genuine and entirely his. Elric waited at the circle's center without his crown. He had set it on the altar stone to his right, placed there deliberately. He wore the white of the moon rites. He stood in the cold moonlight with his hands at his sides, and waited with the ease of a man who had been waiting for 4 years, and had learned that patience was not the absence of wanting. It was the presence of certainty. Avena walked the path from the palace gate alone. She had been offered an escort, an attendant, a formal procession with the full ceremony of a founding blood mate receiving the crown's recognition, or she had considered all of these options with the same practical attention she gave most decisions, and she had declined them all, because 5 years of having no agency over her own movement had made her very precise about the movements she got to make herself. She walked at her own pace. Not slow, not fast, her own pace. The white of the moon rites was not the white of surrender. It was the white of declaration, the color that said, "I am present, I am choosing, I am here in full." It sat on her correctly, which she had not expected, but which Iskira, who had overseen the fitting with the focused attention of someone taking the task personally, had apparently anticipated. Her wolf was warm and gold beneath her skin. Not pressing. Present. The warmth of a fire that had been burning long enough to know it would not go out, but that did not need to fight to exist. That simply was. Elric turned to look at her as she entered the grove. The 200 wolves in the assembled pack held the held-breath silence of an audience that understood it was present for something that should not be rushed. No one moved. The torches moved, slightly in the mountain wind. The pine branches shifted above the circle, releasing small cascades of settled snow that caught the light as they fell. She walked to the center. Before the ceremony words were spoken, Elric stepped close and asked her quietly. For her alone, the words, too low to reach the record, offered in the space between them where only they existed. Tell me in your own words that this is what you choose, not from gratitude, not because leaving Duskmere needed a destination, from want. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at him, at the pale winter eyes, at the steady face of a man who had asked this question privately, outside the record, because he genuinely needed the answer and not the performance of it. For 22 years, she said, I was given a version of myself and told to live inside it. You never gave me a version. You waited for me to show you the real one. You sat in a cold courtyard for 3 months and held still while I found my way back. You read every book I asked for. You knocked on every door. You asked permission at every threshold. She did not look away from him. And I found my way back. And you were still there. Not because you needed me to hurry. Because you understood that I would arrive when I arrived, and that was the only timeline that mattered. A pause. I choose you, not from gratitude. Because I know you, and knowing you, I want you. That is the only reason I have. It is enough. He took both her hands. His eyes in the moonlight were everything the pale winter sky was, clear and wide, and entirely steady. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the full presence of someone who had been looking for this specific person for years and who, having found her, had no intention of looking at anything else. The bond completed. She felt it the way deep structure settles when it is finally correctly aligned after years of working around a misalignment. Not a sudden shock, not a dramatic change, but a fundamental rightness. Something settling so deeply true that the truth of it was almost too large for one body. His wolf at the edge of hers, vast and old and patient in the way only very certain things are patient, and tender in the way only very old things are tender, having learned the difference between strength and force. The pack howled. 200 voices rising from the stone circle through the ancient pines and into the open mountain sky in a sound that was not the sound of an audience approving. It was the sound of a pack recognizing its own, the specific, cellular recognition of a thing returned to where it belonged, of a wolf who had been designated absent for 5 years, arriving in full sight, in full strength, fully present, not as an omega, not as a defective, not as a liability or a resource or a story someone else was telling, as herself, as who she had always been. Avena stood at the center of the sound and felt it from the inside for the first time in her life, not from the edge, or not from the east side room with the window that got no afternoon sun, from the center, from exactly where she was standing. She was inside it. She had always belonged inside it. 3 months after the bonding, early morning, the eastern tower's highest balcony faced the mountain, and, on a clear day, the very distant suggestion of the northern sea, a line of blue at the horizon that appeared and vanished with the cloud cover, present enough to know it was there, far enough to retain its quality of possibility. Avena stood with a cup of tea that Iskira had left outside the balcony door without being asked, because Iskira had been paying attention for 3 months, and now understood Avena's mornings with the quiet, accurate attentiveness of someone who had decided to do this particular job well. But the air was clean and cold and sharp and entirely her own. Torin appeared at the balcony doorway at the 7th bell with the morning correspondence, which he delivered without the formality he used in official settings. Here, on this balcony, in the early morning with the mountain visible and the tea present, he was simply Torin, a man who had spent 12 years serving a king he respected, and had recently expanded that service to include a queen he was beginning to respect in an equally specific and somewhat differently expressed way. "The formal review of Jarex Lockmere's case," he said, opening the correspondence. "Complete. Alpha rank revoked permanently. Financial penalty assessment, full restitution to the pack treasury and individual restitution to Avenna Ironwood, as calculated at compound interest from the date of first dosing." She nodded, looked at the mountain. "The stewardship appointment," Torin said. "The council has a strong candidate, Kaizen Westmore, your mother's younger brother. He spent 20 years in packland management in the southern reaches. He was exiled from Duskmere twice in the decade before you arrived, both times following formal arguments with Jarex over compound governance decisions. A man who argued with Jarex and was exiled for it, twice, the specific kind of man who was, therefore, reliable. Tell the council I recommend his appointment," Avena said. She looked at the mountains. "And tell the stewardship team that the labor quarters on the east side of Duskmere compound are to be properly insulated and converted to apprentice training rooms. The east wall gets no afternoon sun. No one should sleep on that cold side in winter." Torin was quiet for a moment. "That is a practical suggestion," he said. His voice carried the warmth he allowed to surface only when he considered the moment worth it. He went back through the door with his correspondence. The balcony door opened again a few minutes later, and Elric stepped out with his own tea and his hair still loose from sleep, dressed in the informal clothes he wore when he was simply himself, rather than the king performing the duties of being the king. He came to stand beside her at the railing and looked at the mountain with the easy comfort of a man in a place where he is exactly where he is supposed to be. He did not say anything. Neither did she. She leaned into his shoulder. He put his arm around her, steady and warm. As the sun moved above the mountain line, filling the balcony with the first direct light of the morning. Not the cold ambient light of before dawn, but the actual sun, direct and clear and warm on her face and her hands and the cup she held. Below, in the eastern reaches, a pack that had called her Omega was learning what she had always been. The formal record was distributed to every territorial archive and every pack council from the northern mountains to the southern border. It would be read. It would be on file. Every wolf in the eastern reaches who had a question about what an Omega designation required, about what founding blood was owed, about what it meant to hold authority over another person and what that authority was not allowed to do, would have the record, and the record would answer them. The pack that had tried to bury her had buried themselves instead. The king who saw a goddess in her scars had been right about what he saw, and the girl they called broken had never been broken. She had been the fire. They had just been very determined to put it out. She stood in the morning sun with the mountain at her back and her wolf warm in her chest, and the man she had chosen steady at her shoulder. And she breathed the clean mountain air of a life that was entirely hers. Chosen, built, arrived at through 5 years of survival that had never been breaking, had always been becoming. And she let herself feel it. Not the relief of rescue, not the exhaustion of the aftermath, the actual feeling of a life lived from the inside, freely, as herself, in full. That was what no one in Duskmere had ever wanted her to have. But she had it anyway. She had it now.